This lecture will focus on this religion's beliefs and its history. In a way, talking about the history of this religion is the same thing as talking about its beliefs. Let me explain what I mean by that. This is a monotheistic religion. That means a religion that believes in the existence of one God. This God has a name and a history and even a relationship. The God's name is Yahweh, and you see that here on slide 2. This God is understood in terms of what this God has done. And there are two important things that this God has done, which set the definition in Judaism for what this God is, what this God is like. First, this God is the creator. This means that this God, Yahweh, is the creator of everything that exists. All that exists because Yahweh has created it. And second, this God has a relationship with God's people. This relationship is referred to as the covenant. And a covenant is a kind of a relationship. It's sort of like a contract in some ways, except that it's less static, it's more organic. It has a future, it has a past, it has a sense of commitment, a relationship like a covenant. In the covenant, the relationship is this. Yahweh chooses these people to belong to Yahweh's own self and commits Yahweh's self to these people. And in return, the people agree to and commit to being the people that belong to Yahweh. So the covenant's terms are that God will be the God of these people, and these people will be the people of this God. It's a mutual commitment kind of thing. And there are like responsibilities that both members of this covenantal relationship need to live up to. And that's what makes it a relationship. So the understanding of what Yahweh is like comes from the history of the religion. And the history of the religion's self is an explanation of how the religion has been and the ways that the people, the Jews, have related to Yahweh. There are several important points of this covenant, which itself is sort of a story of the people of Yahweh. The covenant is established with Abraham. So Abraham is maybe the earliest, most significant figure in Judaism. Yahweh approaches Abraham and his wife Sarah, or Sarai, and makes the agreement or the promises that begin the covenant with these two people. Later, Moses is another prophet who takes another step with the covenant, and working with God succeeds in liberating God's people from a bad situation, and then at the end of that liberation receives from God the explicit, clear expectations that God has of God's people, or in other words, the law or the way that they are supposed to be living. So these are only two prophets of many prophets that are important in Judaism. Finally, there is the Torah, which is the core of the sacred texts of Judaism. You may have heard the Torah referred to as a way of saying the law, and that's sort of true, although your course textbook disagrees with translating it that way. Torah means way or path or a right way to be or a method. It is sort of a law in the sense that it is the expectations that Yahweh has of the people that Yahweh has chosen, what they are supposed to be like, how they ought to live. But at the same time, the Torah is not only the list of do's and don'ts, it's also the story of the law, because the people's understanding of how to live comes from their self-understanding. And their self-understanding is that they are the people chosen by God. Being chosen by God comes with, you can imagine, a lot of responsibilities, particular duties, commitments, but also enjoyments, privileges, and experiences of being the people that God has identified and chosen. So the Torah is an explanation of how the people ought to live, and it's also the story, the history of all of the times that these people over centuries or millennia have lived up to the covenant and have failed to live up to the covenant, and the ways that Yahweh responds. Moses is one of the most important figures in this religion, and we'll talk more about Moses next week. You'll be reading and looking at some videos that tell some of the high points of the story of this specific prophet of Judaism. But you're probably already familiar with the story, or at least you might be. The story of Moses begins with the story during which God's people, the Hebrews, are in slavery in Egypt, and Moses is a person that God chooses and sends to go liberate the people from the situation of slavery. And this story is laid out clearly in the sacred text in the Torah. But Christianity has absorbed Judaism's sacred texts, so the same story exists also in the Christian Bible, in the Bible book that's titled Exodus. And Exodus is basically the high point, the main point of that whole story, because that's a story at which Moses does exit the land of slavery with God's people. After the liberation from slavery, Moses receives the Torah from Yahweh and gives it to the people. And this is understood as being a hugely important gift. The point at which God just makes it really, really clear exactly what God expects of the people, and a description also of what it is like to be God's people. In maybe more familiar terms, the gift that Moses receives from Yahweh on behalf of all the people is, in another way to put it, the Ten Commandments, or the clear laid out 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 explanation of how God expects God's people to live together. So some history. Just like Hinduism, Judaism is a religion with a beginning that's too far back for us to really identify exactly where and when and how it began. So we do know that in some time around 2000 BCE, there were many, many groups of nomadic tribes near and around and in the Arabian desert. We know that they all had different religious affiliations, but a certain group of them sort of evolved towards an understanding of one particular God whom they called Yahweh. This group of people settled and developed a kingdom of their own in the area that we today would refer to as Palestine. By 1200 BC, they were established there and had an identity and a religion and a language and a kingdom of their own. There were eras during which these people were ruled by kings and eras in which they were ruled by judges, but all of them were continuing to tell and to grow through the story of this covenant relationship between these people chosen by God and God, their interactions and how they are in the world. But at the same time, there are a lot of other people, a lot of other cultures and kingdoms and religions in this region. And the Hebrews or the Israelites or the Jews were really not the most militarily advanced for most of these millennia. So by the 500s BCE, these people had been conquered and overcome by a couple of their neighboring rival kingdoms, most notably the Babylonians. In the 580s, the Babylonians tore through what remained of this former kingdom and leveled the temple and destroyed the land and either killed or enslaved or evicted the people that were living there. This was a period of exile. And this era of exile had a deep impact on the development of these people's religion. So before the period of exile, the way that these people were belongers to Yahweh was by all these practices that they carried out in the temple. But once they've been exiled from their land, that's not possible. So they need to come to some different ways to understand how Yahweh can be with them and how they can demonstrate and strengthen their faithfulness to Yahweh without a temple to go to. So through the 500s and the 400s, 300s, 200s, 100s BCE, history and time changed quite a bit. Another temple was built and another empire rose, By 70 CE, the region was under the auspices of the Roman Empire, and the Second Temple was destroyed. Again, this was a crisis for these people, and it continued to change the way that the religion was carried out. So as your book argues, this marks the beginning of Rabbinic Judaism, or a particular version of Judaism that looks a lot more like what we see today than it did in 500 BCE or 1200 BCE. At this point, Judaism is a religion that is a lifestyle, so it's not centered on a day-to-day basis around the temple per se. Instead, there are practices that are maintained all through the way that a person lives her or his daily life in the home, or from what they study, or from how and what is eaten and when. Proceeding through history, as you see on this slide, there are more times to come for these people after the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 CE. Under the power of Christianity, there are crusades and then Inquisition, which attack, vilify, murder, torture, and attempt to convert to Christianity the Jews who are living in this continent in this period. Now, the book gives some very good descriptions and explanations of all of this. And the way that the book describes it is to indicate that this was not just sort of, obscure branches of Christianity that were carrying this out, but these were practices that were carried out on behalf of the religion as a whole by the powers that be. So for people who belong to this religion today, this is a history that needs to be reckoned with very seriously. Moving into the 20th century, there are pogroms through which villages of these people are forcibly relocated. The Enlightenment in the 1700s is a philosophical movement that changes the oppressions of the Jews, but it also changes Judaism itself. Under the changes that come with the Enlightenment, the people experience a rise of secularism and a beginning of an emphasis on individualism. So what this means is that religions are not quite held in authority or esteem as they were before the Enlightenment. A lot of religious practices begin to get looked down upon as superstitious. And individualism, sort of just barely getting started under the Enlightenment, means that the authority of a specific religious leader is beginning to get looked at not as something that should automatically be followed, but something which an individual has a right and a duty to critique on his own. So Judaism adapts to this, and some different practices and different understandings of what it means to be Jewish are made necessary by the philosophical changes with the Enlightenment. Zionism is a movement that begins between the 1700s and really finds its place in the middle of the 20th century. Zionism is the idea that there needs to be a place for the Jews on the world where they can go and have sovereignty, or have the ability and the right to govern themselves in accordance with what they understand is the right way for Yahweh's people to be as a society. Zionism has a lot of different forms and a lot of different takes, and the book that you're reading describes this in a couple of different ways. But in the middle of the 20th century, the urgency of the need for a safe place and an autonomous state for these people is made clear with the events of the Holocaust, or the Shoah. And you will be reading a little bit about that this week. The upshot of all of this is that in the 1940s, in the middle of the 20th century, the nation of Israel is founded to be a country or a nation state which does exactly that. Gives a place for these people to continue their history and their beliefs and their practices in accordance with their own understanding of what it means to be the people who are chosen by Yahweh